All right, so we've accomplished quite a bit in step one. We're moving on to step two, but let's review what we've done so far. So right in the center here, we're rendering our halftone component. We're feeding it in an image, and it's coming up with a halftone a rendering in SVG. And around that, we have our entire application layout. There's nothing really here yet. We're just kind of blocking it out with these color-coded areas. So we have a side panel in blue right here, a floating header in yellow, and a floating footer in purple. So this is kind of how our application will be blocked out. As we go on to step two, let's see what we're going to accomplish. So as you can see, what we're going to end up with, things largely look the same, but we replaced our floating header with something that actually has a button and some thumbnails in it that will be clickable down the road, but they're not there yet. Basically, this step is going to help us organize our application and be the model for the rest of the components going forward. So with that in mind, let's get started organizing. All right, so as we get organized, the first thing I want to do is do something about this CSS. So everything about our web component right now, our app web component, lives in app.js. I don't necessarily like that. So styles, for sure, can be moved into a different file. I think that's a good thing to do because, I don't want to sift through my entire file and pass all this CSS when I actually want to work on application logic. So let's create app.css.js. And keep in mind, this is still a JavaScript file. I'm giving it a .css here just so we know it's CSS. It's supposed to contain CSS, but at its heart, it's still a JavaScript file. And I'm going to import CSS from lit. So keep in mind, this CSS that we're importing right here, it's the same thing as this tag template CSS we're importing in lit right here. We're gonna use the same tag template for our CSS. We're just moving it to this file right here. So in app.css.js, we're going to export const style equals, and then use our tag template here for CSS. And so now we can copy all the CSS we have in our app.js inside our main component here and move that over to our app.css.js. And now back in app.js, we actually don't need our CSS tag template anymore because we're going to get rid of this whole block right here. And in its place, we're going to import style from app.css.js. And then all we need to do here in our array is return that. Of course, it practically becomes a one-liner just because things are so short right now. So yeah, if you look at that CSS file we just made, it's still JavaScript. It's still a string inside JavaScript, and we're importing that into our application component. There are actual web dev server plugins that you can use and just make all this go away and treat it like an actual CSS file. It'll look like a CSS file, but what this web dev server plugin does is it wraps, as you're requesting it from the server, it wraps it with all the stuff you need for lit. And it'll kind of mimic a CSS file. It looks like a CSS file when you go to edit it, but it will act like this does right here as CSS in JavaScript. I'm not going to worry about this plugin right now because this is, it's already pretty minimal. So let's just run with this and not get too complicated with our server setup. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, and I'm going to warn you ahead of time, you don't really see this out in the wild with folks doing web components, at least not as far as I've seen, and there's a good reason why. So I also want to reorganize all this HTML markup and put it in a separate file as well. So let's do that. I'm going to make a app.html.js. And this is going to be the exact same strategy we use for our CSS file. So we're going to import HTML from lit. And again, our HTML is the exact same HTML tag template we're using here. We're just moving all this stuff over. So we're going to export const template equals, I'm going to do something different here, and I'll explain why in a bit. I'm going to make this an arrow function. And this arrow function is going to return some markup. And so just like the CSS, I'm going to copy and paste all of this markup over to my new application HTML file. And I'm going to import template from my app.html.javascript file. And then, of course, I can just return my template, which is a function, of course. Now, before I explain further, let's just make sure this works. Let's make sure this renders what we had before. So good, everything still works. We didn't break anything, so that's good news. So now back in our app.js file, let me explain why this is an arrow function. And I'm going to create a property. Our property is going to be just a simple message. Let's say it's hi from space. Now back in our HTML here, how would you expect we would render this? Normally I could just do this.message. And so when we insert a property of our class here, it'll render as HTML, and you'll be able to see this message. It won't look pretty, but you'll be able to see it. And of course it's broken. And the reason is there's an error. And this error is it can't read properties of undefined. So it's trying to read our new message property on the class, and it can't read it. Why is that, you think? So of course the reason is that message is a property of our class here. And so this is the scope of our class, this class. But here we're in a different scope. So of course, right in our arrow function here, this is not the same scope. In fact, it doesn't seem that this even exists. So for this reason, it's why I'm making this a function, so I can pass in this. So this, again, is the scope of this class. And then we can say, this gets passed in as scope, let's say. That's just my variable that I'm making up right now. And then we can say scope.message. And let's try this. And so we can see the placement isn't all that great, but we are rendering the text. So that's the reason why I'm using this function, this arrow function right here, just to be able to pass the scope in and render anything we have going on in our class right here as properties. So let's get rid of this because we don't need this message, of course. Yeah, so back in our app.js class, well, first let's get rid of this HTML. We're not using it anymore in this class. So now the question is, why don't you see more folks doing this? Personally, I think the application component, you can focus on the logic a lot more. Now that the CSS has moved out, now that the HTML has moved out, so I personally haven't seen people do this, and I thought I was being clever when I did this. So why don't you see this more? And the answer to this is TypeScript, at least from what I've found. So when I started a TypeScript project and I started to take this approach, I could see right away why this wasn't working. So let me show you why. Let's take that message property that we had and make it a private variable. Now, of course, my IDE is complaining that this isn't valid. That's because I'm not using TypeScript. This is simply JavaScript. But hypothetically, if this was TypeScript, this would be valid. We're saying this message property of the class right here, it's private. It can't be accessed outside the scope of this class. And guess what? This is exactly where we are right here in this scope. This scope is just an arrow function inside a different import. If I were to try to say scope.message right here, TypeScript would complain at me and say, you can't do that, it's a private variable. You can only access it inside this class right here. And as we're not in TypeScript and I don't plan to convert this project to TypeScript, what I'm doing right now seems perfectly valid and a great way to organize my code. But if you look at best practices online, you're probably not going to see this mentioned because best practices tend to span both JavaScript and TypeScript implementations. So I don't think anybody's really going to suggest this. But like I said, no plans to convert this to TypeScript, so I think it's a perfectly good way to organize our code right here. So with our HTML moved out, I think we're in a really good place right here where we can make all of our other components be organized in the same fashion. So we have to work on the side panel, we have to work on the floating header, and we have to work on the floating footer. And so to prepare for this, I'm just going to copy this exact same app structure for each and every single component. We'll start with the side panel. We'll rename all of our files. We'll change our import to import the side panel. We'll empty out all of our HTML. And we'll empty out all of our CSS. And of course, we need to import the correct imports for this component. And get our class name right. And lastly, get our tag name right. And of course, we'll repeat this for our remaining components. And I've forgotten we don't need to import this halftone web component except for in our original app component. Now to support all those components we just made, even though they are empty, they still will work as components. So let's add the imports in here so they can actually be officially imported in and load. Now, of course, you won't see any changes here, but let's open up our dev tools. Now, in our dev tools, we can see that, just like before, the tag still exists, but let's open it up. So we actually see the shadow root when we open it up. And if this was just acting like a div, a normal div, without being connected to a web component, you wouldn't see the shadow root. Now, not all web components have shadow roots, but I didn't turn off this feature in lit. So just the fact that I know we're using lit, I know it should have a shadow root. And so because this shadow root exists, I know it's working. So with our components now activated, let's address this floating header right here. Let's add some content to it. So I'm gonna jump over to floatingheader.html. This is the new file we just added. So I'm gonna jump over to floatingheader.html, and this is in our new floating header folder. And it takes care of the HTML markup for our floating header component. Now I know we want to render a few thumbnails in this space to use for the user to click through the thumbnails and change out the image. So let's just add a flat list right now of images. So lit gracefully takes this array and just renders it. So this is great. But now I want to do something with these images. And so for each of these images in this array, we're going to use the normal JavaScript map function and map it to a photo. And so for each of these photos, we're going to return some markup. And this markup says, I want to render a button with the background image being the photo that we're using. So let's try that out. And yeah, it works. You can barely tell it works though, because the buttons are really tiny and you can barely see what's inside them. So let's change that up with some style. So in our floatingheader.css, I'm going to add a style for our button. So each button is going to be 50 pixels by 50 pixels. The background size is going to be cover, which means it's going to crop itself maybe if the aspect ratio is wrong, but it's going to fill the container. No border. We're turning off our button borders, and we're adding some spacing in between each thumb. We're adding 5 pixels on the right of each thumb. And so this is starting to look a lot better, but I don't like it hugging the top up here. I want it to live all the way over here on this side. And so I'm going to add another style. So we're going to select the host. And if you're not familiar with host, it's a web component standard thing. The selector is for the component that you're working with right now. So I'm going to tell my web component, my floating header web component, that it's going to have a flex display, a flexbox display. And we're going to justify all the content to the end, or the right side of the box. And I'm going to put a padding of 15 pixels all around my component. And the width of the component is going to be 100% of the available space minus my left and right padding. So 15 pixels times 2, 30 pixels. And there we go. They're all on the side now. There's some padding. It kind of looks a little strange though, because they're hugging the side. And this is where we can start taking away some of the inline style we added. So in our app.html file, you might remember we added a bunch of inline style here to give it some background color and some size, just to have something initial to work with so we can see the layout. We can start taking this away. So let's do that on the floating header. Before I do that, notice we're overriding the width with 100%. Whereas before we were using 100% minus the padding. And that's why it looks a little weird. And so here we go. The buttons appear right where I want them to be. Let's remove this red coloring on the main background though. So So now our buttons look good, but our halftone disappeared. But if you remember, we colored our halftone white, so let's just make it red now. All right, so this is starting to look like an actual application, minus these areas right here that we need to fill out in the future. Now what I want to do is I want to add our first Spectrum web component. Are you excited? And I'm going to put this button right before our photo list. It's going to be Spectrum button. And let's just give it some garbage text. And we have something. It's not looking too pretty, and there's a good reason for that, and that's because we need to add a theme. I'm going to go back to my application.html file for my main application component. I'm going to import a few things: theme, theme light, and scale medium. So now we can come back to, why did we put a div container here when the web component itself acts like a container and it can have flow if we give it style? Well, the reason is we're going to make this an SP theme. So this is the Spectrum theme component, and we need this SP theme tag to wrap anything we want to use as a Spectrum web component inside of our application. So in our case, we want to wrap everything, so it needs to go at the outer edges of our entire application. So this is why I needed some kind of container, because I wanted to make it into our SP theme tag. But this SP theme tag needs a little more help, so it needs a scale, and our scale is going to be medium. And all this means is that text, for example, it's going to be a medium size versus super large or super small. It affects the scales of a lot of other aspects of our UI as well. And the last thing we need is the color, and we're going to do light. You're probably familiar with dark mode apps. We can do that if we change the attribute right here, but I'd like to make this a light app. Now, before we try to reload our page, we changed our div to an SP theme, so we do have some styling to take care of. So in our app.css, let's change div to SP theme. So now, as we reload our page, we can see our button acting like a normal button. I do want it to take on some of the size properties of our other thumbnails, though, so let's add SP button in our floatingheader.css. To give it a width of 50, height of 50, and a margin right to keep it separated from the other thumbnails. Now, let's get rid of this garbage text. I want to add an icon to this now. I'm going to import two things. One is the actual icon component, and the other is icons workflow. So there's a set of icons that can be used in workflow situations, and this is that set, and we're going to grab the add icon from that. And then we can just replace our text with SP icon. And as the content here, we're just going to say add icon. And of course, it is a function, so it does take parameters, but we're not going to give it any. Now, if you have an eye for detail, you might notice that the plus icon is a little bit north of center. So what's going on with that? So here's what's happening. Our button actually does accept slots, and these slots are named slots. So we have to say slot equals icon. So the concept of a slot again is where we can populate a web component that has a shadow DOM with other children. Normally, if you populated something with children like this, you wouldn't see it because it would fall outside the shadow DOM, it wouldn't get rendered. But lucky for us, our button is set up to accept slots. That's part of the architecture of the web component that we're using. Now, it can accept a few different types of slots. We're telling it that the type of slot it wants to accept is a named slot called icon. And our SP button knows how to work with icons like this. But let's also give it a size as well to be more specific about how it should be rendered. So now as we review, this looks perfect to me. So I think this might be a good time to pause here because we've done a lot so far. We've taken every component, even our dummy placeholder ones, and made them into lit components. We know they're being taken over by lit because we see the shadow root in our dev tools right here. We've also started to fill out our floating header with actual content. It's not wired up yet, it doesn't do anything, but we'll get there. And so in our next step, we're going to take our floating footer and add content to that. And our side panel right here, we're going to actually load this up with a lot of Spectrum web components to ultimately control how this halftone pattern gets rendered. So looking forward to seeing you in the next step.